Hi there, my name's Ros Cuthbert. I'm an artist and co-director of the art shed Winscombe, and I'd like to show you how you might go about painting a bunch of flowers using wet in wet and wet in damp techniques. Here are my flowers, picked fresh from the garden this morning. So I'm going to start by drawing with the brush, and I'm going to begin with a dilute mix of phthalocyanine blue. I'm just roughly placing the flowers, deciding on my composition. I have some pale lemon yellow dahlias here, tinged with pink, pale pink. I have a daisy, large daisy, some marigolds, I have a beautiful magenta dahlia, and some antirrhinums. It's not so much the identity of the flowers that's concerning me today. I am going to paint quite loosely and show you how to work with the techniques of wet into wet and wet into damp, and to abstract, paint simply from the subject, not obsessing with photographic realism. So there's my beginning, and now with my number 16 round, I'm going to make a start. So if I use just water to start with, and I wet the shape with that, that will act as a conduit for the pigment that I might then add. So just want to show you that on this dahlia here, maybe this one also, just quickly suggest its spikiness. And I'm mixing a little pool of lemon yellow, and a little pool of a mixture of red orange and carmine to give me a soft pink. So let's start with the lemon yellow. I'm quite simply placing that in the centre and encouraging it to flow outwards. This little dahlia has got more yellow in it than the larger one. And then with my watery wet pink, I'm going to add and let it flow into that wet area, the wet areas that I previously just soaked with water. So there'll be a lot of running to and fro of the colour. I bring my brush outwards from the centre. The little dark spot of colour that usually results from a brush mark, a loaded brush mark, will be on the outside of the petal, which will help defining the petals. Okay, I'm going to leave those like that, and I'm simply going to let nature take its course, and we'll see what happens in a little while, that very wet surface. So now I'm going to turn my attention to a red gladioli behind the white daisy. And I'm putting out two colours. I'm putting out two different shades of red. I'm putting out cadmium red light, which is a quite scarlety red. And because it's a very bright flower, I'm making sure that my mixture is intense. So I'm spending some time going back and forth, loading my brush like that with the pigment. That's the scarlet. And for the sake of a little bit of speed, I'm going to damp this brush and do the same thing with the naphtha red. And a little bit of carmine. So if in doubt, check your washes, your colours on the edge or on a spare sheet of paper, and make sure that they're nice and rich. It's always a good idea to have a little spare sheet or the edge of a piece of paper to test your colours. So I'm going to start with the scarlet, and because I've got a white flower in front of that, I'm going to have to work in the negative spaces between the petals of the white flower to obtain the shape that I want. So I'm looking at those spaces, and at the same time as painting the red flower, I'm also finding that I can indicate the shape of the white flower in front. So this wash is going on quite flat. I'm allowing the colour to flow. I have enough colour on my brush to be able to pull the colour around and let it flow into place. I'm guiding it with the tip of my brush and letting it flow and pulling it around with both the tip and the tummy of my brush, or the fat part in the centre of the hair. So you've got tip, the belly and the heel of the hairs of the brush. So this is quite there's another lovely red gladioli flower further down here, and I'm coming quite close to some very wet work that I've already done. So if I don't want to wait to allow that to dry, then if I just work around it carefully, leaving a small gap, the colours won't interfere with one another. But with very free painting, wet into wet, wet into damp, flower painting, if a little bit of contact is made, then just enjoy it and see what happens. It's part of the fun to have a sense of excitement and openness to what happens with this process of wet in wet and wet in damp painting. There we go. There's a little bit of contact made between those two colours, which are now just leaking together. So I'm still working around the white flower and just completing gladioli behind. Okay. So if the colour is bleeding too much, you can wipe your brush and you can suck that colour back out. So with a damp brush that's not loaded with moisture, you can vacuum out the colour. It simply sucks it back up into the brush. Okay, moving on, I'm going to look at some isolated shapes here, and these are the marigolds. So let's mix some quinacridone gold. Some people pronounce it quinacridone. And again, a nice strong mix for a beautiful strong flower. And although I'm using number 16, if I dance on the tip of it, it's got a beautiful point, and I can use that point to define the petals of this marigold. Now the other marigolds are a little bit more paler yellow, so I'm going to add some cadmium yellow. I'll begin with that. Let me put my wash here. It's cadmium yellow. Enough water for the colour to flow, but not so much that it makes it very dilute. So that should be right. So I'm beginning with flat washes in a way, flat areas of colour. Using my brush to define the shapes. But I'm working quite loosely. I'm not obsessing with getting correctness of detail. What I'm after is a kind of overall impression. So I'm going to block in a few more colours here. And as things dry, I might begin to start to interact with those drying shapes. Using my brush to try to almost handwrite in the shapes. So for the magenta dahlia, I have magenta pigment, and as far as I can with these very wonderful bright flowers, I'm trying to use pigments unmixed straight from the pan or half pan. So with this dahlia, so I'm using magenta pigment for this beautiful magenta dahlia. There's a hint of green in the center of that dahlia. So I'm mixing emerald green or cadmium green and a little lemon yellow. And I'm going to just drop it into the center to suggest the greenness of the space inside, deep inside the flower. I'm going to help that, shape that a little bit. And that's still very wet, so I'm going to leave it to dry, to do its thing. I think my first wash of scarlet for the beautiful red gladioli is, it's damp, it's still a little damp, I think. Let's see if we can get it to catch the light. It's drying and it's damp here and there. So I don't want it completely dry, so I'm going to now start painting back into that shape with a couple of these other reds that I've mixed. First of all, the naphtol red. And this is wet on dry. This wash has dried quite well, so it's damp here and there, but this section here is quite dry. So the first wash and the second wash are not interacting. Just here, I'm going to use carmine. It's interacting a little because there's still some damp there in the paper and in the pigment. So if I want a little movement between those two colours, I clean my brush and wipe it a little on the pot, and possibly even take some more moisture out of the back of it with a kitchen towel, and then I might just have enough moisture to take around that shape and just soften the edge of that wash so that it will bleed a little bit into the damp area. And I can encourage this to do the same here, with a little damp on my brush. When you work back into a wash that is still damp or drying, it's better not to use very much water. If you add a lot of water to a situation like this, you're likely to get backblends and create much more impact than you might want. So by taking moisture out of the brush, you can let the brush behave a little bit more with less impact, so that the colour moves gently where you want it, and you don't get a complicated interaction. Right, let's see what else is drying. So my marigolds are still quite wet, but they are drying off. They're definitely shiny in places and dull in others, but I'm going to go with that. I'm going to risk just placing another little bit of colour within those shapes so that we can see what happens there. Okay, so the paler marigolds really need a little hint of a deeper shade. So I can use some of this orange, but I'm going to also use some yellow ochre. I'm going to add a little purple to the yellow ochre, the centre of this darker flower here. Just a little colour, and I'm going to let it do its thing. Just about here I have a lovely dark flower, and I have some green stems, so I think I'm going to do the green stems next. It's time to put in that tracery, that pattern of stems. So I need a slightly duller green for that. I'm going to use sap green. There's a diaphanous palest pink Antarinum just looking through between these flowers. So I'm going to, again, using the tip of my brush to guide the colour into the shapes. And touch, perhaps with my number 6, touch of green. And I can just touch one colour into another and let them do their thing. Time to do that lovely dark dahlia. Alizarin crimson. Lovely, rich, sultry crimson. Alizarin crimson. I'm going to add some burnt umber. Just a touch more water, just enough water to loosen the colour. I want a really rich mix for this. And I'm going to add a little tiny touch of indigo to really get the richness of that wonderful flower. Okay, it's almost black, but not quite. So I need to find out about that marigold. It's still quite wet. Perhaps at this stage, to speed things on a bit, I'll use my hairdryer. Still a little damp. I think I can work around that. So although I drew in blue, pale blue to start with, I can see that as the painting's developing, I'm choosing to change my mind about the shapes and the places of certain things, including this little flower. Possibly the flowers are moving a little, as live things do. And to make it a little easier to get into those shapes, I'm going to turn the board, being careful where I place my hand to rest the back of my wrist so that I can get into those shapes. Leaving a little bit of white doesn't hurt. It helps to give sparkle. The shapes I've painted are not quite the same as the flowers, but I'm going here with the painted shape for an impression. Being careful not to touch the dark flower with this stem. Let it dry a bit first. So some more sap green over this side. In these negative spaces. And this is nice and dry now, so you can have no fear of the colours moving. I add this green here. It's a hint of shadow in there, so I can use some of the dahlia mixture perhaps to really darken these negative spaces. So the little pale daisy I've got a mixture of ultramarine and Chinese white, and I'm going to just suggest some shadowiness in the heart of the daisy. Daisy's closing quite a bit now since I drew it. The afternoon is drawing to a close and the light is fading a bit. So painting a little bit from memory. That's okay. Let's add a stronger hint of tone. Center. And get a sense of that daisy's shape and fragility. I'm going to leave it a little while before putting that soft yellow middle to let that colour settle and dry somewhat. But I think I can add some detail to these two dahlias here. And I'm going to do that with a little pink. This is the same pink that I mixed for the pale wash. Let's see how that looks. That might be okay. Where's the centre of this flower? Just suggest it. Looks like a very complicated flower, and indeed it is, but I'm just trying to find a simple visual language for just expressing the form. Just dab a little of that out. It's better. So I think what's next? Probably filling in all this space here, which is really quite mysterious. The deep reds and the gladioli still down here, and flowers behind, orangey flowers behind. It's quite shadowy, so let's use carmine, just softened with a little sap green, slightly neutralized, and let's make a start with that. And I'm going to continue using sap green with a hint of Hooker's green, a deeper shade of green, just to add some leaves within there. Some are going wet on dry and some wet into the soft red that I've just put down. and a lighter green, sap green with a little lemon yellow. And I'm just going to cast caution to the wind here and just let them bleed together. There are leaves and stems and little tiny hints of colour in the background there. And a little more shadowy green interior visible just between these two dahlias, which we can hint at by adding a little of that slightly neutralized green, neutralized with a little of the complementary opposite, red, to a sort of more woody tint. Time to put in the centre of the flower daisy. I'm using a dull yellow ochre, and I'm going to add some strong cadmium yellow. And let it do its thing. So I think with the magenta dahlia, I'm going to try a little bit of lifting out, and I'm just going to very simply add some moisture and see if anything lifts out. It hasn't lifted out very much, so tickle those areas again and just lift out a little bit of pigment to suggest internal petals in that shape. Lifts quite easily, just needs a little encouragement. I think for the background, negative spaces, I'm going to suggest a sort of soft blue. So I've changed my water. So I've changed my water and I'm going to mix a pale cerulean blue to provide a little ambient shadowy space in the background. So I'm going to mix a nice little cool colour. I'm choosing cerulean blue because I know it granulates in a rather fun way. I'm going to begin by just wetting the surface. And I'm going to do this in sections. So I'm not after a smooth flat wash here. I'm after a sort of softly modulated wash. So getting my brush into these little spaces with just water to start with. And go as far as this. Just encouraging moisture across the surface and trying to sort of even it out. And then with my cerulean blue, adding the pigment into the moisture. So the cerulean will only float on the surface of the moistened paper. A very thin blue wash mixed here. Let's try that. Just popping the cerulean blue into the wash and not trying to even it out, letting it move, letting nature take its course and seeing what happens. So some plain water this side. Easing my brush around the shapes. Perhaps going up to the next narrow point here between the edge of the picture space and this little purple flower. A bit of fun here with the colour. Leave it like that, I think. Moving on round. Pulling out this little wash of pink just with water on my brush. And one more little touch of colour into the little dahlias. Okay. I think I'll leave it there.